Her voice sounded throaty and sultry over the phone. When she opened the door in response to Johnny Lydell's knock, it was obvious that the voice belonged. She was tall, her red hair was piled on top of her head, and a blue silk gown managed to cling skin tight to her figure under the guise of covering her curves. It was, Lydell noted, a figure worth clinging to. High-breasted, narrow-waisted, and long-legged. Her lips were full and moist, her eyes green and slanted.
"You're Johnny Lydell?"
The slanted eyes hopscotched from the broad shoulders to the face approvingly.
"Won't you come in?"
She stood aside and took his hat as he walked by.
"Thank you for coming."
"I got here as soon as I could, Mrs. Hart," Lydell told her. She led the way into an expensive furnished living room. As she walked, her hips worked smoothly against the fragile fabric of the gown. It was highly debatable whether she wore anything under it.
"Will you have a drink?" she asked. "I could certainly use one."
Lydell nodded and dropped down on the couch, watching her until she disappeared into the kitchen. When she returned, the view from the front was equally satisfying. She set the bottles and glasses down on a small table in front of the sofa and dropped down beside him.
"I need your help very badly, Mr. Lydell," she said. "I've gotten into something way over my head."
Lydell nodded. "Mind filling me in?" The redhead caught her lower lip between her teeth and worried it.
"It makes me feel like such a fool."
She leaned over with devastating effect on her neckline, spilled some liquor into each of the glasses, and dissipated any remaining doubt that she might be wearing something under the gown.
"It all started a little over a year ago. I was married to Ed Hart at the time."
Lydell picked up one of the glasses and swirled the liquor around the sides. "You're not now?" The redhead pursed her lips and shook her head.
"We were divorced almost 6 weeks ago."
She held up her glass.
"Will you drink with me to my freedom?"
Lydell grinned and clicked his glass against hers. "Then there's really no reason to keep calling you Mrs. Hart, since you aren't."
"I'm Lucille."
She sipped at her drink and studied him over the rim of the glass.
"You know, I feel better about telling you this story already. I have the feeling you'll understand."
"Try me." The girl tossed off the rest of her drink and set her glass down.
"I guess you'd really have to know Ed Hart to fully understand. He was dead set against gambling and drinking. Pretty straight-laced."
She shrugged, leaned over, and added some more liquor to her glass.
"I put up with it because—"
She paused and looked up at Lydell, the soft lips smiling.
"Why should I fool you? I put up with it because Ed Hart was exactly what I'd been gunning for since I left Ohio. A millionaire."
Lydell showed no signs of being shocked.
"But just the same, I like to take a little fling at the track or cards." She shrugged. "I didn't figure there was anything wrong in it."
"But he would have?"
"He would have been furious, so I just didn't tell him."
Lydell nodded and picked 2 cigarettes out of the humidor on the table, lighted them, and passed one to the girl. "And you lost more than you intended?" The redhead nodded.
"I guess I don't have a copyright on this story."
She took a deep drag on the cigarette.
"I went for about $5,000 more than I intended. I had enough IOUs floating around to paper a good-sized room, and then they lowered the boom."
"Who had this paper?" The redhead lifted the cigarette from between her lips and studied the carmined end with distaste.
"A nasty little chiseler named Carl Reuter. Know him?"
"Just what I read about him in the gossip columns, and that's not very pretty."
"He's even crummier than that."
She took a swallow from the glass and seemed to be washing the taste of the name from her mouth.
"He married old Madeline Stewart when she didn't have all of her marbles and spent most of the rest of her life going through her money. When she died, she was practically broke."
"How does he pay his rent these days?"
"By playing cards with the right people, mostly married women."
Lydell nodded. "And you were his pigeon?" The redhead shrugged.
"I figured it was only money and that I'd be able to square it with him as soon as Ed Hart came across with either an allowance or a settlement."
"But?"
"Carl got itchy. He said he needed the money right away and suggested that I tell Ed all about it. The implication was pretty broad that if I didn't, he would."
She finished the drink and leaned back against the cushions, her breasts jutting forward against the robe.
"That would have spoiled everything. I managed to persuade Carl to hold off, so he came up with another idea."
Lydell fought a losing battle to keep his eyes on her face, and lost it happily. "What was that?"
"I had no money, no allowance, but Ed kept me well decked out in jewelry. I guess it made him feel like a big shot. Anyway, it was insured for plenty. Carl suggested that we fake a robbery and collect from the insurance company. I could pay him off with the jewels, Ed would get the money, and nobody would be the wiser.
Lydell groaned. And you went for that? He freshened up both drinks and handed her a glass.
A smart babe like you. I went for it. It looked like such an easy out. Carl got his money by selling the jewels, I got my IOUs back, and Ed got his money back from the insurance company.
She put her hand on Lydell's knee and leaned over.
There was just one thing. Carl insisted that I write him a letter telling him I was paying him off with my jewels. Just a precaution, he said.
Lydell nodded. And he's been bleeding you ever since. The redhead nodded.
Mercilessly.
She got up, walked to the window, and stared down into the street below.
I can't take much more. What can I do?
He's got you pretty much over a barrel, Lydell told her. He's got your letter saying you gave him the jewels as payment for a loan. He's probably got photostats of the original IOUs to back it up. And you're on record as making a claim they were stolen and taking the money from the insurance company. He shook his head. You're in trouble, baby. I don't suppose he'd put a price on that letter.
Don't you think I've tried?
She turned and walked back to where he sat, the sway of her breasts tracing designs on the shiny silk of her robe.
I've done everything to get it back, everything that's humanly possible. I tried to make a deal, but he wasn't interested in me.
She wet her lips with the tip of her tongue, her eyes half-lidded.
Would you be interested in a deal like that, Lydell?
Lydell's eyes ran over her. I couldn't get that fee past my bookkeeper, baby. He grinned. Besides, I don't have the letter.
It wouldn't have to be the fee,
she told him.
Just a bonus.
You know where we can find this Carl Reuter? The redhead nodded. How soon can you get dressed? Carl Reuter was listed in the telephone book as living at the Settler Arms, an expensive pile of rocks and plate glass overlooking Riverside Drive. Johnny Lydell plowed through the deep pile carpeting to the desk and asked the tired-looking man in the morning coat for Reuter's apartment number.
Mr. Reuter isn't entertaining today, the desk man told him in a bored tone.
I'm not here for laughs, Lydell answered. This is business. Tell him I'm representing Mrs. Hart, Lucille Hart. It's in reference to the sale of some property. The desk clerk shook his head doubtfully at the prospect of Lydell getting up and was prevailed upon to check his hunch with a phone call. After a murmured conversation with the mouthpiece, he reversed himself.
It's the penthouse.
He nodded in the direction of a bank of elevators.
The in-cage.
Lydell walked to the elevator and rode up to the penthouse. He rapped on the door and waited. After a moment, the door was opened and a man stood in the doorway. Lydell couldn't make out the man's features, but from the bulging shoulders and complete absence of neck, it didn't strain his deductive powers to place him as a professional bodyguard.
You the guy the Nance at the desk phoned up about?
The bodyguard's voice was heavy and coarse. Yeah, is Reuter in?
Mr. Reuter,
the man in the doorway growled. He nodded Lydell through the darkened vestibule into what appeared to be a library. In the light, the man turned out to have bulging eyebrows and a misshapen nose in keeping with the heavy-set shoulders. There was a dark shadow of a beard on his jowls. His beady eyes were unfriendly as he looked Lydell over.
You healed?
He asked. Lydell shook his head. This is a friendly call. He offered no resistance when the butler fanned him, satisfied himself that Lydell was unarmed.
Mr. Reuter's in the den.
He led the way down the corridor with a surprisingly light step for a man his size. At the far end, a door led into a comfortably furnished den. Carl Reuter sat behind a highly polished desk. He didn't raise his eyes from the 5-inch switch knife with which he was manicuring his nails. He was thin and dapper. His thick hair was shiny, and he affected a 3/4 part designed to give his widow's peak its best play. His face was almost perfectly oval. The only thing that spoiled his good looks was his thin, purplish lips. What do you want? You got something to sell. I want to buy. Reuter raised his eyes from his nail and tested the point of his knife against the ball of his thumb. You used Lucille Hart's name. Who are you? My name's Lydell. Johnny Lydell. Reuter's eyes flowed from Lydell's to the battered face of the bodyguard inquiringly.
He's a private eye. I heard of him before. Bad medicine, the bodyguard told him.
Reuter's eyes dropped back to the knife, and he started paring at his nails again.
You must have mixed me up with someone else. I have nothing to sell.
Let's stop playing games, Reuter. You have some evidence against my client. It's paid for itself a dozen times over already, but I'm ready to buy it again, this time permanently."
"Sit down, Lydell,"
the little man behind the desk invited. When the private detective showed no sign of accepting the invitation, the butler grabbed him by the arm and shoved him into a chair.
"That's better."
Reuter got up from behind the desk, walked to where Lydell sat, and pointed with the knife so that its tip was less than an inch from Lydell's throat.
"We know all about what a tough guy you are. We're not impressed. Get smart and quit while you're ahead."
"You're scaring me to death, Reuter," Lydell growled. "Now that you've finished playing Mr. Anthony, let me give you some advice. Don't make me come back after you. Like I told your boy, this time it's a social call. Next time it'll be for business." The knife at his throat didn't waver. Finally, Reuter shrugged.
"What good would that do your client? If anything happens to me, plenty of evidence against her goes to the district attorney."
He pasted a leering smile on the thin lips.
"Wouldn't it be a shame to lock stuff like that in a cage for 15 or 20 years?
He jabbed suddenly with the knife and nicked the skin on Lydell's neck.
"It would be very foolish of you to show your face around here again. Ever."
Lydell touched the spot where the knife had broken his skin and examined the drop of blood on his finger. "I have an idea we'll be discussing this again under more favorable conditions, pal." Suddenly he lashed out with his heel and caught the little man in the shin. Reuter howled, dropped his knife, clasped both hands around his shin, and hopped about. The bodyguard swore under his breath, grabbed Lydell by the lapels, and dragged him to his feet. The private detective broke the hold with an upward and outward fling of his arms and smashed his toe into the big man's instep. The butler grunted with pain and dropped his guard. Lydell sank his left in the man's middle and chopped down against the side of his neck with his right. The bodyguard hit the floor face first and didn't move. Reuter leaned against the desk, his hand on his shin.
"I'll get you for this, Lydell," he said. "Nobody pushes me around. And you're crazy if you think this'll help that red-headed bitch of yours. I'll take care of her, too. You can tell her that for me."
Lydell looked around the office, debated the advisability of trying to find the evidence, and decided against it. He walked over to where Reuter stood. "I'm giving you until midnight to get up what I came for," he told him in a low, hard voice. "If you don't come up with it, I'm coming to see you again. Then you'll tell me." The little man started to bluster, but it froze on his lips when Lydell caught the front of his jacket and lifted him up on his toes. A thin line of perspiration glistened suddenly at the little man's hairline. "Don't think you won't get it up, Reuter," Lydell told him. "You'd be surprised how persuasive I can get." He shoved Reuter backward and sent him sprawling on his back across the desk. "I'll expect you by midnight, in my office." Reuter made no attempt to move. The bodyguard on the floor started to moan his way back to consciousness. Lydell walked over to where he lay, caught him by the collar, and dragged him to a chair and dumped him in it. "And I wouldn't figure on this guy doing you much good." He turned his back, walked to the door, and disappeared into the corridor leading to the outside hall. The redhead was waiting in his car on the block north of the Settler Arms. Johnny Lydell slid into the front seat next to her.
"How'd it go?"
she asked. Lydell shrugged. He's a tough little cookie, but I think I threw a little scare into him." He touched his finger to the nick on his throat and showed the faint smear of blood to the girl. "He sure likes to play with that shiv of his." The redhead's eyes widened.
"He did that?"
While he was still on his feet. Lydell grinned crookedly. He swung halfway around in his seat and watched the entrance of the Settler Arms through the rear window.
"What do we do now?"
the redhead wanted to know. "Sit and wait. If my guess is right, he'll be coming out any time now." Lucille shook her head.
"Why should he? Won't he figure to be safer up there with that trained gorilla of his to watch over him?"
Lydell grunted. "I've got a feeling he's lost a little faith in the trained gorilla. The last time I saw him, he wasn't capable of watching over anything, including himself." The redhead's mouth was an O of admiration.
"You went up against both of them?"
She moved closer to him.
"I'm glad you're on my side. But what if Reuter decides to hole up in there anyhow?"
Lydell shook his head. "I don't think he will. I gave him a midnight deadline. My guess is that Reuter's not the type for toe-to-toe slugging. He'll try to hole up somewhere until he can put the heat on you to call me off, or until he can get someone to take care of me." The girl lit a cigarette nervously and took a drag.
"But even if he does run, what good will that do us?"
She exhaled the smoke.
Maybe I've only made it worse by going to you and...
Stop worrying, baby. Here's the way it figures. I threw a real scare into Reuter. Deliberately tried to make him run for it. When he hides out, does he leave his most valuable possessions behind for me to maybe dig up while he's in his hole? The redhead studied Lydell's face, and the tiny frown between her eyes melted away.
You mean you think he'll take the evidence with him?
Lydell shrugged. Wouldn't you? He took the cigarette from between her lips and took a deep drag on it. Lucille caught her full lower lip between her teeth and considered.
It does make sense at that. Then, when you find out where he's hiding, you go in and take it away from him.
Lydell nodded. And if he's real good, he might even know I'm doing it. The redhead was on her fourth cigarette and fifth nail when Carl Reuter walked out of the Settler Arms. He stood in front of the building and looked up and down the street. After a moment, the bulky form of his bodyguard joined him on the sidewalk. A bellhop brought out 5 suitcases and piled them at the curb. At the sight of the suitcases, the redhead dug her nails into Lydell's arm.
If it's only in that stuff, Johnny. If it's only there.
Lydell nodded and motioned for her to sink down below the window level as a cab pulled up to the hotel and Reuter and the big man climbed in. The cab whizzed by the parked car and headed uptown. Johnny Lydell waited until the cab was a block ahead, then kicked his motor into life and eased the car away from the curb and followed it. The cabbie threaded his way through the drive traffic, started bearing east, and finally came to a stop on 110th Street in the middle of the block between Park and Madison. Lydell drove slowly by and marked the number in his mind. Reuter and the big man were too busy taking care of the luggage to pay any attention to a passing car. Lydell drove to the corner of Madison and pulled the car to the curb. Take the car back to your place, he told the redhead. I'll stick out here and wait until one or the other leave. Then maybe we can check on my hunch. He took his shoulder harness and a .45 from the glove compartment, took off his jacket, adjusted the harness, and covered it with his jacket. Lucille wet her lips nervously with her tongue.
Do you really think he'll have it with him, Johnny?
She put her hand on his knee.
If he has and you get it back, I'll never be able to tell you how grateful I am.
Lydell grinned. You can make a start any time you want to, baby. After the car had melted into the downtown traffic on Madison, Lydell crossed 110th Street to a small confectionery store and bought a pack of cigarettes. He stood in front of the store watching the doorway across the street through its grimy window. After about an hour, he went outside and leaned against the far side of the building where he'd be invisible to anyone in any of the windows of the building Reuter had entered. The early heat of the day started to cool off as the shadows grew longer. Lydell was debating the advisability of waiting until evening, and then, if necessary, forcing his way in and facing both men. He had almost decided upon it when the door across the street opened. The bodyguard stepped out onto the stoop and looked in both directions. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket, lit it, and stood smoking for a second. Then he walked down the steps and blended into the stream of whites, browns, yellows, and blacks that ebb and flow the length of 110th Street 24 hours a day. Lydell waited until the big man had reached the corner of Park, then he crossed the street. He walked up the short stoop of the house from which the bodyguard had just come. The vestibule was small, foul-smelling, empty. Lydell looked around and scowled. There were no mailboxes, merely a few scribbled sex suggestions in crayon and pencil. Several were illustrated, but seemed impractical, if not impossible. Lydell pushed through the half-open door into the hallway. Here, an odor compounded of equal parts of Spanish cooking, inadequate toilet facilities, and unwashed bodies was almost gagging. As he walked in, an old man in a dirty undershirt came up from the cellar stairs at the back of the hall. He stared at Lydell suspiciously through a pair of small, old-fashioned metal-rimmed glasses. He took a short-stemmed pipe from between toothless gums and spat on the floor. His eyes never left Lydell. I'm looking for a friend of mine. He's the new tenant. Just moved in today, Lydell told him. He gave me the apartment number, but I've forgotten it. The old man continued to stare and spat again. He gave no sign of having heard. Lydell reached into his pocket, brought out a bill, and folded it lengthwise. The old man dried the palm of his hand along the seam of his pants, reached out and snagged the bill.
There'll be no trouble, mister.
His voice was beery, coarse. Lydell grinned and shook his head. No trouble. He's an old pal.
He's in 2C.
He struck the bill in his pocket and headed for the street. As soon as he had closed the hall door behind him, Lydell started up the grimy, uncarpeted stairs. 2C was the second door from the stairwell. Lydell put his ear to the paper-thin panel but heard nothing. He tried the knob and found it locked. He could detect a faint rustle of motion from inside the room.
That you, Benny?
Reuter's voice was muffled, cautious.
Yeah.
Lydell tried to sound gruff, raspy. There was the sound of a chain being taken off, a key turning in the lock. The door opened a crack. Before Reuter could get set, Lydell put his shoulder to it and pushed it open. The little man swore under his breath. There was a flash of steel, and the tip of his knife jabbed Lydell right above the belt buckle.
How'd you get here?
He snarled. I just followed the smell. You leave a stink a foot wide.
You sure want it bad, sucker,
Reuter said. His tongue wet his purple-red lips and retreated back into his mouth. His sleepy eyes looked malevolent, lethal, half-veiled by discolored lids. He looked beyond Lydell into the hall, satisfied himself that the private detective was alone, and motioned him into the room. He shoved the door closed with his foot and locked it with his hand behind him.
Nice of you to save us the trouble of looking you up. Now I won't have to stay in this rat hole any longer than it takes to get rid of you.
Lydell looked around the squalidly furnished room. Not quite as fancy as the Settler Arms, is it, Reuter? But I figured you'd rather go on living in a rat hole than to stop living entirely. Reuter smoothed the hair back over his ears, using his fingers as a comb.
Speak for yourself, Seamus. I expect to go on living. Too bad you can't say the same.
He jabbed the point of the knife into Lydell's back.
Get those hands up on the back of your neck where I can see them.
Lydell laced his fingers at the back of his neck and permitted Reuter to reach around to him to relieve him of his gun. The man with the knife made the mistake of getting too close while he was doing it. Lydell pivoted at the waist, the point of his elbow catching the shorter man in the temple. Reuter staggered and tried to slash out with the knife. Lydell spun around, brought up his knee viciously, simultaneously chopping down at Reuter's neck with the side of his hand. Reuter managed a choking grunt and dropped the knife. He stood swaying for a brief moment, then his knees folded under him. He went to his knees, fell over forward, face first, didn't move. Lydell replaced his .45 in its shoulder holster, picked up the knife that had fallen from Reuter's fingers, and tossed it on the table. He turned the unconscious man over and went through his pockets. There was almost $100 in bills, a handful of silver, and an alligator wallet. There were no baggage checks or check room receipts of any kind. Lydell took Reuter's keychain and turned his attention to the little man's baggage. After 15 minutes, he knew that what he was looking for was not in any of the valises nor on the man's person. He picked up Reuter's knife and slashed the sides of the bags, slit their bottoms looking for a secret compartment. Finally, he straightened up, raked his fingers through his hair, and looked around. The man hadn't been in the room long enough to find any but an obvious hiding place, he realized. He checked the drawers of the bureau, felt on top of the closets, and stripped the bedding from the bed. The thing he was looking for was under the mattress. It was a thick briefcase. Using one of the keys on Reuter's chain, he opened it and dumped its contents on the bed. They consisted of photostats of IOUs, letters from women turning over their jewels as payment of my debt, newspaper clippings of jewel robberies. Lydell whistled at the size of the racket and dumped the papers back into the briefcase. Reuter's eyes opened and rolled back in his head. He seemed to have difficulty in focusing them. Lydell caught him under the arms and dragged him to a chair. Carl Reuter was no longer dapper. The thin purple lips were now blue, the eyes watery, and the carefully combed hair hung lankly down over his face. He was sick. His head rolled uncontrollably from side to side. He seemed to lack the power to lift it. Listen hard, Reuter, Lydell told him. You're finished. I'm destroying these letters and the IOUs. Then I'm tipping the cops off to the racket you've been pulling. If you're smart, you won't be here when they come looking for you. There was a light tap on the door. Lydell walked over and put his lips close to the door.
That you, Benny?
He whispered in a passable imitation of Reuter's voice. The voice on the other side was urgent.
Yeah, let me in.
Lydell carefully unlocked the door and waited until he detected signs of the bodyguard holding the knob on the other side. Then he yanked it open with all his strength and pulled the man on the other side off balance. Benny's eyes popped when he recognized Lydell. He started to raise his hands, but his reflexes were too slow. Lydell hit him in the stomach with a straight left and slammed his right against the big man's jaw. Benny reeled backward. Lydell hit him again with an overhand right that drove him still farther back. The low banister caught his back, gave way with a screech, and the big man disappeared into the well of the stairway. Heads popped out from doorways all along the hall and were withdrawn as though they were on strings. Lydell stood at the head of the stairs, looking down at the tangle of arms and legs that were the big man. He walked back into Reuter's room and picked up the briefcase. The man in the chair stared his impotent hatred. Lydell grinned at him, walked down the stairs, and stepped across the unconscious bodyguard. At the bottom, he came face to face with the old man in the dirty undershirt. He had a bag filled with beer bottles in his arms. He looked from the unconscious man on the floor to Lydell.
"You told me there wouldn't be no trouble, mister,"
he said reprovingly. Lydell grinned at him. "No trouble at all, Pop. It was a pleasure." End of chapter 3. Johnny Lydell pushed through the frosted glass door that bore the legend, Johnny Lydell, Private Investigations. A red-headed girl sat at a typewriter in the outer office pecking at its keys, taking excessive care not to fracture the finish on her nails. Her hair was cut short, curled around her ears. She wore a sheer silk blouse that made no attempt to discount her obvious assets. She looked up as Lydell walked in and consulted the baguette on her wrist with an annoyed frown.
"You said you'd keep in touch," she told him. "I've been calling every gin mill in town. It's almost 9 o'clock.
"You shouldn't have waited, Pinky," Lydell told her.
"Now he tells me," she groaned, "after I've gone and broken my date."
"Sorry, Pink. I've been up to my ears."
"In business, I hope."
She pouted. She reached over and picked up a penciled memo from her basket.
"Some babe's been calling you every hour on the hour."
"Lucille Hart?" The redhead nodded.
"Sounds like she's in a real fever to hear from you."
Lydell nodded. "Any other calls?" Pinky shook her head.
"She kept the line so busy nobody else could have gotten through," she sniffed. "What's in the briefcase?"
"Dynamite. Enough to blow a dozen screwy dames into a cell."
"Padded?"
"Barred." He held the briefcase up and glowered at it. A little character named Reuter collected things. Letters, mostly. I traded him for his collection.
"What'd you give him? A fractured skull?"
"The x-rays aren't down yet." He walked over to the door to his private office and pushed it open. "Give me a few minutes to clean this up and I'll make up that dinner you missed. The Hart gal leave a number?"
"Yeah, want her?"
Lydell nodded and walked through into the private office. He dropped the briefcase behind the desk and sank into his swivel chair. After a moment, the telephone on his desk buzzed. He snagged the receiver and held it to his ear. "Lucille? Johnny Lydell." He could hear the sharp intake of breath across the wire.
"I've been trying to reach you for hours, Johnny. Is everything all right?"
Lydell picked up a cigarette from the pack on his desk and stuck it in the corner of his mouth. "Everything's fine, baby."
"You've got them?"
"Sure, I told you to stop worrying, didn't I?" The wire was silent for a moment.
"Are you going to bring them over?"
"In the morning." He lit the cigarette and blew a stream of smoke at the receiver. "I can't make it right now."
"I'll be here all evening. It doesn't have to be right now."
Lydell considered and dropped the decision. "Better make it the morning, baby. I've got a couple odds and ends to clean up around here." The voice on the other end seemed mildly disappointed.
"If that's what you want, I'm terribly grateful, Johnny."
"Forget it, baby. I'll see you around 11 in the morning." He dropped the receiver on its hook and leaned back. The redhead from the front office came stamping in.
"Don't call me odds and ends."
"If you persist in eavesdropping on other people's conversations, you're bound to hear unpleasant things about yourself. After all, Miss Hart's a client."
"That's another thing, baby. What's with this grateful routine? She gets a bill, doesn't she?"
She made a face.
"I'm terribly grateful, Johnny," she mimicked.
Lydell chuckled. "You sound almost as though you didn't trust me, Pink."
"That's a coincidence. I don't."
The redhead stalked to the corner of the desk and helped herself to a cigarette.
"What do we do for her, anyway?"
"I told you, she wrote some letters that mightn't look good to a judge and jury." Pinky dropped into the armchair across from the desk.
"She was probably just proving she could write."
"Lay off, Pink. It was just a business deal. We get the letters back and trade them to her for a check."
"From the sound of that drool of hers, it was more like monkey business. How come we never have any men clients that get that grateful?"
Lydell leaned across the desk and held a lighter for her. "Maybe I should use a different deodorant." He set the lighter down on the desk. "Don't give me a bad time, baby. I've had a hard day."
"I'll bet,"
the redhead snorted. "Where do you want to go for dinner? How about a ride out to Tony's Trouville and—" There was the sound of a closing door in the outer office. A moment later, the doorway to the inner office opened and two men stood in the doorway. Lydell's hand streaked for the .45 in his shoulder holster and froze with the tips of his fingers brushing the butt. Pinky sat still, her cigarette halfway to her lips. Her eyes, like Lydell's, were glued to the muzzles of the twin .38s that stared back at them unblinkingly. "Hope we're not breaking up anything," one of the men grinned. He was heavy-set, thick in the shoulder. He wore a pearly gray fedora, its brim pulled low over his eyes, a dark suit, dazzlingly white shirt, and a dark tie. The .38 looked like a toy gun in his heavy hand. When he grinned, a gold tooth glistened in his lower jaw. The other man was slim and wore no hat. His hair, beginning to show signs of thinning at the temples, was light and wavy. He was pretty in a weak, effeminate way. He ran to flashiness in his clothes, from the powder blue of his suit to the rainbow colors in his tie. The hand that held the gun also sported a heavy gold bracelet. He ignored Pinky and concentrated on Lydell. The heavy-set man led the way into the room, and his partner took up his place beside the door. "Mind if we come in?" "Be my guest." Lydell looked from one to the other, but failed to recognize either. "What's this all about?"
"We're just returning a call you made today to a friend of ours,"
Wavy Hair told him. His voice held the faintest trace of a lisp, was low, intimate, almost as though he were whispering.
"You were pretty rough with our friend. We don't like people to be rough with our friends, do we, Stanley?"
The big man stuck his gun in the waistband of his trousers and shook his head. "No, Lydell, we don't like it at all." He walked over to the desk and stared down at Lydell. "You know, Joey, I see a lot of these private eye characters on TV. They're real tough characters, Joey. Real tough. Ah, Lydell." Lydell stared up at him. "We get by." The cigarette waggled in the corner of his mouth as he spoke. Stanley shuffled around the desk and grinned down at him. His heavy hand swung in a short arc and knocked the cigarette from between the detective's lips. "You don't want to smoke so much, Pally. It's bad for your wind." Lydell struggled to get out of the chair, but was at a disadvantage, and couldn't ward off the brutal chop Stanley aimed at the side of his neck. He grunted and sank back into the chair. The big man reached down and pulled him to his feet. Lydell stood swaying, his eyes glassy from the blow. "See what I mean, Joey? They're real tough characters." The big man chopped at Lydell's neck again and knocked him to his knees. The gold tooth glistened in a pleased grin. "I like tough characters."
"Leave him alone, you'll kill him,"
Pinky screamed. She pulled herself out of her chair and started for Lydell. The big man caught her by the arm and swung her around. "Hey, I like babes with spirit." He pulled her against him brutally and sought her mouth with his. She threw her head back and tried to twist away. His lips missed her mouth and settled for the hollow of her throat. Pinky got the flat of her hands against his chest and pushed with all her strength. He let her get an arm's length away, then reached out and caught her blouse at the neckline and tore it away. Her breast spilled out as she struggled to get away from him. He slid his arm around her and bent her backward.
"Cut it out, Stanley," Wavy Hair snapped. "That's not what we came for. Take care of Lydell and let's get out of here."
Stanley covered the girl's mouth with his and straightened up. "That was real nice, baby. Let's do it again sometime." He stared at her nakedness and reached over and grabbed her breast.
"I told you to cut it out,"
Joey disapproved. The big man looked at him and grinned. "If you never tried it, don't knock it," he leered. He started to pull the girl toward him again. Tears glistened in Pinky's eyes. She swore at him and lunged for his face with clenched fingers, nails going for his eyes. The big man sidestepped, hit her across the face with the flat of his hand, and knocked her sprawling. She lay there quietly, dress twisted over her thighs, a thin trickle of blood running from the corner of her mouth. Stanley walked over and leered down at her. "You ought to try wearing pants, baby. You wouldn't want to go catching cold." He laughed loudly at her and turned back to where Lydell had struggled to his hands and knees. He caught him under the arms and dragged him to his feet. "Where's the stuff you took from Reuter this afternoon?" Lydell shook his head groggily and rubbed at the side of his neck. His head rolled forward helplessly. Stanley caught a handful of the private detective's hair and yanked the head up. "Maybe you'd like some more, eh, tough guy?" He slapped Lydell's head to one side with the flat of his hand and backhanded it into position. "I got all night." Lydell made a visible effort to focus his eyes on the big man's face. "Don't leave town, mister," he pleaded. "Don't leave town." The big man raised his hand to hit Lydell again.
"Keep smacking him around like that and he won't even know his own name,"
Joey snapped. "Maybe you got a better way," Stanley growled.
"Maybe. That kind of guy might talk a lot faster if we muss up that female of his."
Wavy Hair sneered.
Especially if we do it my way.
Stanley licked at his lips and grinned.
You'd love that, wouldn't you, Joey?
He walked over to where Pinky lay sobbing and pulled her roughly to her feet.
Your boyfriend wants to see you, baby.
He pushed her over in front of Lydell.
You got company, tough guy.
Lydell's eyes managed to focus on the girl's nakedness. He swore fervently.
You got something that belongs to a friend of ours. Where is it?
Stanley shoved his face so close to Lydell that the private detective could smell the foulness of his breath. The man with the wavy hair walked over behind the girl, caught her arm, and twisted it up behind her shoulder blades. She screamed shrilly.
You better tell us, Pally. Stanley grinned. Joey don't like girls, especially pretty ones. He could have a lot of fun with this one.
Tell him, Johnny,
the girl pleaded.
Tell him!
Lydell tried to reach for the girl, but was slammed back against the desk by the big man.
Where is it?
Stanley growled. Lydell wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and stared at the red smear of blood.
The briefcase. Under my desk.
The big man walked around the desk, picked up the briefcase, and deposited it on the desk. He fumbled with the lock for a moment, dumped the contents on the desk, examined them, and nodded to the other man.
This looks like it, Joey.
He dumped the papers back into the briefcase, closed it, and walked around the desk.
I gotta hand it to you guys. He grinned at Lydell. You sure are tough on TV.
He walked to the door and followed his companion out. A moment later, the front door to the office slammed. The only sound in the office was the sobbing of the girl and the impotent cursing of the man. He tottered from the desk and tried to put his arm around her shoulder. She pushed him away and ran toward the outer office. Lydell stood for a moment, shaking his head in an effort to clear it. Then he walked over to the sink in the corner and splashed water into his face. He was drying his face on a hand towel when the office door slammed again. Pinky stood in the doorway, a sweater buttoned up to her chin, her face a white mask in which her eyes stood out like discolored bruises. She threw a key ring at him.
I'm finished, Lydell, she sobbed. I can't work for anybody I don't respect. I thought you were a man who could protect me from rats like that. You just stood there and let them.
Lydell nodded.
I'll take you home, baby.
You don't have to. I can find my own way. I'll probably be a lot safer.
Her face gleamed wetly from the tears.
Maybe you'd better get somebody to take you home.
She slammed the door behind her. After a moment, the outer office door slammed too. Lydell threw the towel at the rack and walked back to his desk. He pulled a pint bottle from the bottom drawer and tilted it over his mouth. Then he tugged the .45
2
loose
hours
from its
later,
hammock,
Johnny Lydell stepped out of a cab in front of the cafe.
He lit a cigarette,
Verdun,
took
a
two
chromium
deep
plated
drags,
spot
snubbed
with a
it out,
multicolored
reached for
canopy
his
that
hat,
extended to
and
the
headed
curb.
for home in a shower.
As the cab pulled away from the curb, a 7-foot giant in full regalia of an admiral made a production of opening the heavy plate glass doors. Lydell crossed the sidewalk and plunged into the dim interior of the nightclub. He tossed a crooked smile in his hat at the hat-check girl. Lulu Monty or Shad Ryan been in here tonight, honey? He dropped a bill on the counter and picked up a pack of Chesterfields from her tray. The hat-check girl did not pause in the act of adding another layer of paint to her already flaming lips.
Not tonight so far, Johnny. Lulu will be in, though. Never misses a night with that babe of his working here.
She studied her handiwork in a small pocket mirror and rounded off the curve of her top lip with the ball of her pinky.
Want him to know you're looking for him?
Lydell nodded. A 200-pound fashion plate in a midnight blue tuxedo came up to greet him as Lydell walked through the dining room beyond. The headwaiter wore a red carnation in his buttonhole and a lazy smile pasted on his lips. His hair was thick and white, his eyes tired and dull.
Hello, Johnny. Table or the bar?
Lydell considered. Got a table set back a ways, Kurt? The white-haired man nodded.
Anything special on your mind?
Lydell shook his head. Just looking for a couple of guys. Kurt pursed his lips and managed to look concerned.
No trouble in here, will there be, Johnny?
No trouble, Kurt. I'm just shopping for information. The man in the blue tuxedo looked relieved. He snapped his fingers and fussily adjusted his cuffs while he waited for the captain to scurry over. He pulled a menu from under the captain's arm and motioned for Lydell to follow him. He led the way down 3 red-carpeted steps and around past the tables that skirted the dance floor. The one he selected faced the bandstand and was set back from the floor and sheltered by a large artificial palm.
Will this be all right?
Kurt asked solicitously. Lydell looked around, was satisfied, and nodded. He passed a folded bill to the white-haired man. I'm expecting a guy. If anyone asks for me, shoot them right over.
Anybody in particular? Lydell grinned bleakly. Tonight I'm not particular, Kurt. I'll see anybody. The white-haired man nodded and glided off. Lydell watched him pick his way through the tables toward the door, stop here and there at a favored customer's table to bend over and exchange pleasantries. When Kurt had disappeared up the 3 steps to the foyer, Lydell waved down a waiter and ordered a bourbon and soda. He rubbed his fingers gently over the tender area of his face and neck, attempting to ease the throb. He tried to forget the pathetic figure Pinky had made as she stood before him sobbing. He swore bitterly under his breath and tried to wipe the taste from his mouth with a cigarette. The waiter finally showed up with the drink, set it down on the table in front of him, and withdrew. Down on the dance floor, the band blared an introductory chord and the house lights dimmed. A yellow spot probed through the semi-darkness, finally found its way to the backstage door, and picked up the MC as he pranced out onto the floor. He was tall and thin, had unbelievably broad shoulders, and walked with a peculiarly mincing step. Even from where Lydell sat, his teeth looked too white and too even to be real. He fluttered through a couple of off-color jokes that brought a faint ripple of laughter, and sang 2 nasal choruses, of a number never destined to become popular judging by his rendition. Then he raised his hands to cut off the non-existent applause. He gave way to a long line of girls in spangled brasiers and satin pants. They scampered around the dance floor, bare legs flashing, bare stomachs undulating. They ran off the stage and were followed by a tall, full-breasted brunette in a strapless red gown. Her voice was throaty and low. The lyrics of her song were blue and off-color, but throughout the number she maintained an expression of untroubled innocence. She finished her number to a loud burst of applause, grinned at the wolf calls and whistles, and permitted herself to be coaxed into an encore. It was almost 12:30 when Lulu Monty sauntered in. The girls were back with different colored costumes, but with the same routines, the same bare midriffs. This time the effeminate MC was dancing with them, teeth flashing whitely in pretended enjoyment, fooling nobody, least of all the girls. Monty picked his way through the tables and stopped at Lydell's.
"Wanted to see me, Lydell?"
He was thin and wiry. His hair was long, slicked down, chopped off at the end in a duck's tail. He chewed gum constantly and affected an ever-present smile that failed to change the expression in his button-like eyes. "Sit down." Monty looked around cautiously, pulled out a chair and dropped into it.
"What's the play?"
"I want to make, Lulu. 2 guys." Lydell leaned over and dropped his voice. 2 guns.
"Locals?"
Lydell shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. I never saw them before." Monty grimaced.
"That might make it tougher, if they're imported talent. What'd they look like?"
One was a Nance. Marcelled hair and a gold chain on his wrist. Weighs maybe 140. He handled a .38 like he was born with it in his fist. Make him? Monty rolled his eyes up at the ceiling, squinted, and shook his head.
Not from that. How about the other guy?"
"Big. Mean. Weighs maybe 210, wears a gray fedora and a blue suit. He was packing a .38 too, but I got the feeling he'd rather use his hands than a gun." Lulu pounded on his gum with rapt concentration and stared at Lydell. Finally he shook his head.
"You're not getting to me," he admitted. "Team like that should, only I never ran across them."
He plucked at his lower lips with thumb and forefinger.
"Important stuff?"
"Plenty. It's personal business." Lydell grinned bleakly, missing his eyes. "They busted into my office tonight and slammed me around. Roughed up the kid that works for me. I got a real yin to talk it over with them."
Monty nodded. "I'll put out a couple of wires. You going to be around long?"
"All night. If I leave here, I'll leave word where to reach me."
"I'll do what I can," the thin man told him. "I ain't promising a thing, see, but 2 guys like that working in harness, that I should be able to make."
He pushed back his chair and got up.
"I'll check you."
Lydell nodded and finished his drink. He signaled the waiter for a refill and watched Monty as he disappeared into the semi-gloom near the entrance. Lydell lit a cigarette and leaned back, added to the fog of smoke that swirled lazily near the ceiling. He was on his 3rd drink when a figure materialized beside his table. He looked into the face of the master of ceremonies. From here he was older than he had looked on the floor. Pancake makeup was waging a losing war with the crow's feet and lines under his eyes. He had changed to a wasp-waisted tan suit.
"Are you Johnny Lydell?"
Lydell reached over and snubbed out his cigarette. "Yeah? Why?" The MC looked around and dropped his voice.
"Will you come with me?"
He turned on his heel and led the way through the tables toward the backstage door. Lydell waited until he was halfway across the room, then followed slowly. The MC stopped at the door leading backstage and waited impatiently. When Lydell reached the door, he caught the man by the arm. "Where are we going, sweetheart?" An angry red flush mottled the man's skin. He wrenched his arm free with an angry shrug.
Don't flatter yourself.
He turned and flounced through the doorway. The glitter and tinsel of the dining room had no counterpart backstage. The door led to a long dingy corridor lined with doors, smelling exotically of 1 part perspiration to 3 parts perfume. They stopped in front of a door decorated with a peeling gilt star. The MC knocked.
It's Charles, Ruby. I'm decent,
a husky voice assured them. The brunette sat on a straight-backed chair in front of a cluttered makeup table. 6 snapshots and telegrams were stuck in the molding of a fly-specked mirror over the table. The girl was the dark-haired singer from the floor show. She had loosened her thick black hair and permitted it to cascade down over her shoulders, had exchanged the close-fitting red gown for a dressing gown.
Hello, Lydell.
She smiled, exposing perfect small white teeth set between the fullness of her lips.
Waiting long?
Lydell grinned back. All my life, seems like. He waited until the MC had closed the door behind them. Then he pushed the door open a crack and satisfied himself that the man had started down the corridor toward the front of the house. He pushed the door closed. Not that it's not pleasant, but what's it all about?
I have a message for you.
Lydell's eyes dropped to the half-opened robe, to the expansive breast and thigh it exposed. From?
Lulu Monty.
The girl made a half-hearted and ineffectual effort to pull the robe around her.
He called me here, said he couldn't make it back in time.
Lydell pulled over a chair, reversed it, and straddled it, his elbows resting on the back. What'd he find out?
Nothing good.
The girl got up from her chair, walked over to a closet, and brought out a bottle and 2 glasses, one of them stained with lipstick.
He found out who your 2 boys were.
She set the bottle and glasses on the makeup table.
They're strictly poison,
Lydell grunted. They didn't act like they were a tonic. He watched with interest while the girl tilted the bottle over each of the glasses. Where do I find these guys? The girl looked up and studied him from under half-lowered lids.
I just told you. They're poison. Lulu says to stay away from them.
She picked up a glass and handed it to him.
That's why he didn't come back. He didn't want to be seen talking to you.
Lydell tasted the liquor in the glass and approved. Who are they? The girl shrugged.
The big guy's local. His name's Stanley Kalo. He's a strong-arm man from the Longshoremen's Union. Back in the old days, he was an enforcer for the old Purple Gang out of Detroit.
A meatball, eh? Lydell pinched at his nostrils with thumb and forefinger. Where do I find him?
Union headquarters are over the Harbor Cafe down on South Street. He works out of headquarters.
She took a deep swallow from her glass and turned the full power of her eyes on him over the rim.
You're not going up against him, are you?
Lydell pulled 2 cigarettes from his pocket and passed one to the girl. I'm not looking for his hangout to invite him to a dance. He held a match and waited until the girl had drawn a lungful of smoke. How about the other one?
Imported talent, from St. Lou. They call him Joey.
She took the cigarette from between her lips and flicked a crumb of tobacco from the tip of her tongue with a long nail.
He's strictly syndicate stuff. Lulu told me to tell you if this guy's in town, it's for a hit. He thinks you ought to lay low.
If they were going to hit, it would have been tonight, Lydell growled. All the Nance did was cover the meatball with a .38 while he gave me a schlammin'.
A what?
A schlammin', a rough-up. The girl took a swallow of her drink and shrugged.
Then you're lucky, but don't push it. These imported troops are bad medicine.
Lydell finished his drink and set the glass down. Thanks, baby. Tell Lulu thanks. He dug into his pocket, brought out a roll, stripped a few bills from it, and folded them. Tell him to have a drink on me. The brunette took the bills and folded them into her brassiere.
What are you going to do?
Pay the boys a visit. He pushed the chair away and stood up. The girl ran long, graceful, and incredibly thin fingers through her hair.
You're quite a man, Lydell.
She wet her red lips with the tip of her tongue until they glistened moistly.
Will I see you again?
Lydell watched while the girl drained her glass and stood up. Where?
I'm here every night. Just tell one of the waiters you want to see Ruby Cowan.
In case I got thirsty during the daytime? Ruby grinned at him.
It's a rule of the house not to give customers our home addresses.
I'm no customer, Lydell told her. That drink was on the house.
You might try the Backstage Club on 47th if you happen to be in the neighborhood. I'm usually there until 9.
A.M.?
It's not that kind of a club. It's where I live. Make it in the afternoon.
The Harbor Cafe was a grimy, brick-fronted 2-story building set in the shadows of the Brooklyn Bridge, within smelling distance of the Fulton Fish Market. Across the slip, South Street was lined with ships of all nations, tied up at the docks as far as the eye could see. Most of the activity of unloading cargo had stopped for the day, and the only life Johnny Lydell could detect along the broad street was the occasional pier watchman, perched on a packing case enjoying a late evening pipe. Lydell walked into the Harbor Cafe and leaned against the bar. It apparently didn't get much of an evening play, despite the fact that the Union Hall occupied the second floor of the building. A bored bartender stood at the far end of the bar, polishing glasses with a damp rag, listening with half an ear to the woes of a faded and slightly blousy blonde who alternately sipped at her beer and dabbed at her damp nose with a gray-white handkerchief. The bartender nodded to Lydell and took his time about finishing the glass in his hand. He took a last puff on his cigarette, balanced it on the upturned end of a glass, and shuffled down to where he stood. "What'll it be?" "Hickory and water," Lydell told him. He looked around the place while the bartender reached for a bottle from the back bar and produced a glass and some ice from under the bar. A row of booths lined the back wall. At the far end of the bar, a telephone booth seemed to be standing watch at the foot of a flight of stairs leading to the upper floors. The man behind the stick poured a generous slug of the bourbon into the glass and softened it with a touch from the water pitcher. He slid it over in front of Lydell. "Looking for someone?" Lydell shook his head. "Nobody in particular." He dug into his pocket, came up with a bill, and dropped it on the bar. "Stanley been around?" The bartender screwed his face into a puzzled frown. "Who?" "Stanley Kalo. Works upstairs in the Union office." The man behind the bar sucked at a tooth, thought about it, then finally shook his head. "You couldn't prove it by me, mister. Anyhow, there ain't no one up there this hour. You better come around in the morning." Lydell added another bill to the bar. "Wouldn't have any idea where I might bump into him tonight." The bartender bared the discolored stumps of his teeth in a mirthless grin. "Funny thing about questions. Guys come around here all the time asking them. The river's full of guys like that." He ignored the bill on the bar, turned, rang up the drink, and dropped a quarter in front of Lydell. Then he picked up his polishing rag and a glass and seemed to lose interest in the private detective. After a moment, he worked his way down the bar to where the blonde sat damply patient. He leaned across the bar and whispered to her. She stole a look in Lydell's direction, struggled off her bar stool, and walked unsteadily in the direction of the phone booth in the rear. Lydell gave no sign that he noticed, fumbled in his pocket, and brought out a cigarette. He was on his second drink when the door opened and two men walked in. One of them, fat and coatless, with dark-dried crescents of sweat under his armpits, looked to the bartender. The man behind the stick nodded. The fat man walked over to where Lydell stood and took his place at the bar beside him. His companion, a red-headed man of less than 30 with sloping shoulders and long dangling ape-like arms, took up his position on Lydell's far side. "Hear you looking for someone, Mac?" the fat man wanted to know. Lydell turned his head and studied him. Damp wet hair was pasted to the man's forehead. His eyes were expressionless black discs countersunken in pads of discolored flesh. His lips were thick, gleaming wet, with small bubbles forming in the center as he talked. "You've got good ears," Lydell told him. "He's a beautiful lover, Julian," the red-haired man on the far side snickered. "He's queer for ears." The fat man ignored him. "You was looking for somebody, Mac?" Lydell nodded. "Yeah, I was asking if Kalo was around." "You hear what the guy says, Condon?" the fat man asked his red-headed companion without taking his eyes off Lydell's face. "He wants to know if Kalo around. You a friend of Stanley's, Mac?" Lydell dropped his cigarette to the floor and crushed it out with his heel. "We're bosom buddies." The fat man puffed out his lips and blew bubbles. "Any friend of Stanley's, we got to help. Ain't that right, Condon?" The redhead mumbled assent. "What'd you say your name was, Mac?" the fat man wanted to know. "I didn't." The fat man grinned. "Now, that ain't no way to act, Mac. Here, all we want to do is help you find this old buddy of yours. And you're going hard on us. He's bashful about giving us his name, Condon. See who he is." Lydell started to turn and felt the sharp point of a knife pressing up against his side, just above the belt. Behind the bar, the bartender was working hard at being nonchalant, the sweat glistening on his forehead. The redhead slid his arm over Lydell's shoulder into his breast pocket and came up with his wallet. He handed it across to the fat man, who rifled through the credentials and snapped the wallet shut with a scowl. "Who is he, Julian?" the redhead wanted to know. "A fink. A private eye." The fat man shoved his face close to Lydell. "What are you smelling around for, Mac? Who sent you here?" "I told you I was looking for Kalo." Julian slid his hand into Lydell's jacket and tugged the .45 loose from its holster. Always go looking for old pals with a heater? Or maybe you just wear this so's your coat hangs straight. He hit Lydell with the heel of his hand and nodded at a booth. Take him back to a booth, Condon. The redhead jabbed the point of his knife into Lydell's side. Let's go, Fink. He looked past Lydell to the fat man. What are you going to do with him, Julian? The fat man blew bubbles with his lips. I don't know yet. I better get a go-ahead. I'll see what they want us to do with him. He dropped Lydell's .45 into his pocket and headed for the phone. The red-headed man herded Lydell to a booth and pushed him into his seat. He had his back to the door, his body shielding the long-bladed knife he held in front of him. After a few seconds, the fat man came out of the phone booth, mopping at his face with a balled handkerchief. He waddled back to the booth. We're going to take a little ride, Lydell, the fat man told him. The redhead licked his lips. Where? Julian shook his head. This guy must live right. He stands a good chance of walking away from this one. The redhead stared his puzzlement. The fat man shrugged his shoulders. That's a big shot's orders. What do you want from me? The fat man nodded to Lydell. Let's go, Mac. Both men stood aside as Lydell slid out of the booth. The redhead jabbed the point of the knife into his back. You first, Fink, and I only hope you try something. Lydell led the way to the door and waited while the fat man pushed it open. Outside, a black sedan stood at the curb. You drive, Condon, the fat man ordered. I'll keep our boy company in the back seat. He tugged Lydell's .45 from his pocket and shoved it against Lydell's back. Open the door and get in. Lydell obeyed and dropped onto the cushions. The redhead kicked the motor to life and half-turned on the front seat. Where are we taking him? Uptown. The redhead scowled. Uptown? Look, Condon, I'm having enough trouble with the Fink. Don't you give me none. The big shot says take him uptown, and he don't like to be kept waiting. The redhead shook his head and grumbled under his breath. He swung the sedan to a screeching U-turn and headed north on South Street to the East Side Drive. Lydell sat back and watched at the window as they shot past the huge black hulks of the new housing developments that line the drive, watched the sprawling buildings that constitute Bellevue Hospital, the red-lighted staircases, the subdued lights of the wards. Okay if I smoke? He asked the fat man finally. Where are they? Side pocket. Julian nodded. Okay, but when you go for 'em, just use 2 fingers. A hand of yours goes in your pockets any deeper, I shoot it off. Lydell slid his thumb and index finger into his jacket pocket and fished out a cigarette. He hung it in the corner of his mouth. Got a match? The fat man growled under his breath, dug into his pocket, and flipped a pack of paper matches at the private detective. His face was damp and shiny in the weak flicker of the match as Lydell lit his cigarette. The muzzle of the .45 was pointed unwaveringly at Lydell's midsection. Any law against telling me where we're headed? Lydell wanted to know. You'll find out when we get there. Lydell shrugged and subsided. He smoked for a minute. The little rat Reuter's a bigger deal than I gave him credit for being. Who? Reuter. He's the guy that's pulling all these strings, isn't he? The fat man growled and shook his head. Make up your mind, will you? First you want to see the meatball, Kalo. Him I know. This other bum I never hear about. He waved Lydell to silence. Better you stop talking. Like that you save your breath. You may be needing it. The car whizzed by the United Nations underpass, headed for the 53rd Street exit, bore west across town. At Park it swung right to 55th, then bore west again for 2 blocks. The redhead slid the car to a smooth stop behind a row of cars parked in front of the El Condor. Lydell looked out. The El Condor, eh? We're really living it up. The fat man jabbed the snout of the .45 into his ribs and motioned for him to get out. Don't pull anything, Fink. You're just as dead if I plug you in this trap as you'd be in the Harbor Cafe. Lydell grunted, pulled himself out of the back seat, and stood on the sidewalk while the 2 men took up their places on either side of him. Take him to the private entrance, Condon, the fat man muttered. Lydell shook his head. Now I'm really confused. What the hell does a guy like Tony Verone have in common with a little crook like Reuter, or a meatball like Kalo? You got questions? Ask Mr. Verone. Let's go, he's waiting. They crossed the sidewalk 3 abreast and entered a small, unmarked doorway to the right of the crusted plate glass doors to the supper club. The fat man pressed a button inside the door and waited. After a moment, an inner door opened and a man in a tuxedo stood there. He looked from Lydell to the other 2 questioningly. Mr. Verone asked to see this guy, the fat man explained. There was a note of respect in his voice. His name's Lydell." A scowl of annoyance disturbed the placidity of the newcomer's face.
"I'll take care of him."
He was soft-spoken, clean-shaven. His hair had receded from his broad forehead, exposing an area of sun-peeled pate.
"Will you come this way, Mr. Lydell?"
He stepped aside and smiled courteously. "The Harbor Cafe is never going to be able to compete with this place," Lydell told the fat man sadly. "No class." He stepped inside the doorway, stopped, and turned around. "By the way, as long as you're not going to need my gun to shoot me, can I have it back?" The fat man looked from Lydell to the man in the tuxedo. Reluctantly, he produced it and held it out butt first to the man in the tuxedo. "Maybe you better take it." The man in the tuxedo took the gun, weighed it in the palm of his hand, and nodded his approval.
"A nice weapon."
He snapped out the magazine, dislodged the shell in the chamber, and handed it to Lydell.
"Not polite to make friendly calls with a gun."
Lydell snapped the gun into his shoulder holster and grinned. "If I'd known I was going formal, I would have worn my cummerbund." Johnny Lydell followed the man in the tuxedo to a private elevator set in the rear of the corridor. It connected with the El Condor bar through a small passageway. He had a brief glimpse of a crowd of formally dressed men and décolleté women leaning against a bar. At one end, a nationally syndicated columnist was huddling with a recently divorced movie star. The man in the tuxedo pulled open the elevator door and stepped aside. When Lydell was in, he followed and slammed the door after him. The cage rattled noisily to a stop at the third floor, and the gate swung open automatically. The man in the tuxedo led the way along a balcony that looked down on the main dining room of the El Condor. A smell of good food, expensive cigars, and imported perfumes wafted up from the floor below, where a five-piece orchestra was patiently beating out the rhythms of a complicated rumba arrangement. At the far end of the balcony was a door. The man in the tuxedo stopped and knocked. A muffled voice invited them in. The room beyond was half office, half den. It was a huge room with knotty pine paneling and brightly colored Indian rugs. There was no overhead lighting, just a few lamps scattered around, giving the place a warm and intimate glow. Tony Verone sat sprawled in a huge leather easy-chair, his feet propped comfortably on a small table. He looked up from a book he was reading and waved to Lydell as he entered.
"Well, well, Johnny Lydell. It's been a long no-see, Johnny."
Tony Verone's voice showed the results of a determined effort at culture. It was soft and suave. He was long, loose-jointed. His graying hair was thick and wavy. He affected a thin, contrastingly dark mustache, and his ready smile plowed white furrows in the mahogany tan of his cheeks.
"Glad you could come."
"I had a few doubts myself the way that meatball kept jabbing that shib into my ribs," Lydell grunted. "What gives?" Verone's eyes flicked to the man in the tuxedo.
"I don't think we'll be needing you, Lou." He dismissed him casually. "I'll ring when I want you."
Lou nodded and withdrew. When he closed the door behind him, it gave the room a peculiar absence of sound, almost like a vacuum. Verone waved at a chair.
"Make yourself comfortable, Johnny."
He laced his fingers across his chest.
"How do you like the place?"
"A little rich for my blood, but quite an improvement over the 3 Mile Limit Club in the old days."
Verone nodded. "We've done all right. How about you?"
"I'm not complaining." Lydell dropped into a chair. "You still haven't told me what this is all about. I've got a pretty healthy hunch you didn't bring me up here to talk about the old days." The smile furrowed Verone's cheeks.
"But I did. While I've been sitting here waiting for you, I got to thinking about the night you pulled me out of that tough spot on the west side. Remember?"
Lydell nodded. "Vaguely."
"You saved my life that night, Lydell. I've never forgotten it."
Verone reached over, helped himself to a cigar, held one up for Lydell, and drew a shake of the head.
"Those were pretty wild days, Johnny."
He bit off the end and spat it at a wastebasket.
"A lot of unnecessary killing and maiming."
Lydell dug a cigarette from his pocket and stuck it in the corner of his mouth. "And today?"
"We've gotten some sense, Johnny. Today we're in business, and we act like businessmen, not like kill-happy hoodlums."
He stuck the cigar in his mouth and touched a match to it.
"We're all one big outfit now. Not a lot of small gangs trying to cut each other's throats. Today, killing is out. Unless, of course, it's unavoidable."
Lydell nodded. "All very fascinating, but what's that got to do with me?" Verone took the cigar from between his teeth, rolled it between his thumb and forefinger, and studied its firmness.
"Don't make it unavoidable, Johnny." He looked up at Lydell. "You saved my life once. Now I'm trying to save yours. Then we'll be even."
Get to the point, Tony. Verone's lips peeled back from a perfect set of teeth.
All right. The point is that you're making some people dislike you, Johnny. Important people.
Guys like Kalo, for instance, or Reuter. The nightclub man looked at him with a hurt expression.
They're only small fry, Johnny. A meatball and a petty larceny shakedown artist.
Okay, then why all the excitement? I just want to lay my hands on those two characters and...
It's not that simple.
Verone brushed a thin flake of ash from his lapel.
You see, Kalo didn't do that job on you on his own. He was only sent to teach you a lesson.
He looked up.
It looks as though you didn't learn the lesson, Johnny.
Lydell considered it and scowled at the white-haired man.
You sent him, Tony?
His voice was low, cold. Verone shook his head.
No. The first I heard about it was when Julian, he tossed his head in the direction of the closed door, the meatball that brought you here, called. He said you were looking for Kalo, and you looked like trouble.
He tapped a thin collar of ash into a tray.
I remember that look from the old days. So I did some checking, and I figure I'd better have a talk with you.
Who sent him, Tony?
What's the difference? It was a contract. You stepped on somebody's toes, and you had to get straightened out. Fast.
He dropped his feet from the table, walked over to a cabinet set into the wall, and brought out a bottle and 2 glasses.
You see, Johnny, it's like I said. The old days are gone. Each guy keeps what he has, and no one moves in. But when he gets trouble, he can call on the syndicate for help.
He returned and set the bottle and glasses on the table.
An organization is no good unless it covers for its members. You know that, Johnny?
I see your lips moving and I hear words, but they're not saying anything. You're not getting to me.
Where would a little punk like Reuter fit into any setup big enough to send out a couple of enforcers to score for him?
Verone tilted the bottle over each of the glasses, picked his up, and dropped back into the chair.
Nobody's too big or too little to belong, Johnny. There's no such thing as an independent operator anymore. You either operate with the protection of the organization, or you don't operate.
He sipped at his glass.
The only reason you're sitting there is because we've got such a tight operation. Nobody can be killed in this territory without an okay from the local boss.
Such as you. Verone nodded.
Such as me. You know how it used to be, Johnny. Somebody guns out one of my boys, and I go out and knock off a couple of his. He's got to try for some more of mine, and first thing you know, we've lost a lot of good men, and we've gotten a lot of bad publicity.
I still don't see where Reuter fits.
He's operating. He needs as much protection as me or a guy running a book or booking dames.
The white-haired man explained.
Somebody tries to move in on him or push him around, and he calls on the organization for help. Unless they get that help in fast, you couldn't hold them in line.
And if I'm still not convinced? If I still make it my business to get Kalo and Reuter?
You won't now that you know the picture,
Verone smiled.
You're too smart to go up against a stacked deck. Suppose you did get Kalo and this other guy. Do you think it would end there? The organization would have to make an example of you to prove to the other small-timers that we're standing behind them.
He finished his drink and set the glass down.
You might get a couple of the boys sent out for you, Johnny. But sooner or later one of them would get to you. You know you can't fight City Hall, and City Hall's a pushover compared to the organization.
So what am I supposed to do?
Verone shrugged. Drink up and forget it. It's too bad it had to happen, but it doesn't have to happen again.
That's if I play ball. The smile froze on Verone's lips, and a pinched look crept into his eyes.
There's no if about it, Johnny. You either play ball, or you're dead.
His voice had become hard and crisp.
You keep giving the organization trouble, and the finger will be on you. And when it is, the world's not big enough to hide in. Nobody could run that fast.
Maybe I've been practicing in my spare time. Lydell set his drink down alongside his chair and jabbed a finger at the nightclub man.
You've been telling me what I can do and what I can't do.
Now let me tell you something, Tony. He jabbed at his chest with his thumb. I got hired to get back some letters from that blackmailing little louse Reuter. Organization or no organization, I'm getting them. Verone started to argue and was waved to silence. 2 guys bust into my office and strip my secretary and push her around. I'm getting them too. And anybody who gets in my way gets stamped flat. Anybody. Barone sighed and stared at the soggy end of his cigar. I can't stop you if you want to commit suicide, but I can give you some advice. Stay away from those boys. Peek in keyholes. Guard tin coffee pots. Do anything you like. Only don't stick your nose in organization business. He jammed the cigar between his teeth and chewed it angrily. It got too late for that advice when the organization stuck its nose into my business, Tony. Well, I tried. Barone shrugged. He picked up his glass and refilled it. Nothing personal in it. No reason we can't have a drink. Lydell grinned, reached down, and picked up his glass. No reason at all. He held his glass up. To a long life and a merry one. It'll be merry anyhow, Barone told him glumly. Look, Johnny, let me make one last pitch. Here is the picture. Under the new setup, no one can order a hit without the okay of the local boss. Here, that's me. Like I said, I owe you something for saving my life, and I can maybe hold them off long enough for this to cool down. But if you keep kicking over the apple cart, the other bosses like Cleach and Regan, and the rest of them can outvote me for the good of the organization. Then you're dead. Lydell drained his glass and nodded. Real good stuff. Barone picked up the bottle. Another? Lydell shook his head. Why don't you sleep on this, Johnny? Maybe in the morning you'll feel like a little trip until things cool down, and... I'll sleep on it because it's too late to do anything else tonight, Tony. But somebody's still going to pay through the nose for what happened at my office tonight. Grow up, will you? Suppose we do throw the meatball to you. What would it mean? He's just a strong arm doing a job. The organization would still... Maybe I ought to explain my organization to you, Tony. Mine is a lot smaller than yours. It's just me, my client, and the people who work for me. As you said, if an organization lets anybody push its members around, it's no damn good. I'd be no good to my clients, my help, and most of all to myself. I got a feeling a couple of slugs might be easier to swallow. I knew it was a waste of time when I started, Barone growled. Anyway, I tried. That makes us even. Lydell set his glass down and pulled himself to his feet. I'll be seeing you around, Tony. The nightclub man nodded. I've got a pretty strong hunch I'll be seeing you. I hope that when I do, you'll be able to see me back. He reached over and jabbed a button on the small table. The door opened and the man in the tuxedo walked in. Lydell will be going now, Lou. See that he gets into a cab. Might be an idea to have a couple of boys see to it that he goes right home. He needs the rest. Lou nodded, stepped aside, and waited for Lydell. The private detective walked to the door and turned around. How about telling Lou to give me back the slugs I lent him? You know the old saying? The things a man sees when he doesn't have a gun? Barone nodded glumly. Give him back his bullets, Lou. A man can't commit suicide without bullets. The man in the tuxedo dug into his jacket pocket and brought out the magazine for the .45 and tossed it over to Lydell. He watched without a change of expression while the private detective snapped it into place and drew a shell into the chamber. Good luck, Johnny, Barone called over to him. Lydell winked. Make it good hunting, Tony. That's more appropriate. At first it sounded like a peal of thunder. Then it leveled off to the steady beat of a machine gun. Johnny Lydell opened one bleary eye and decided it was only someone trying to knock down the door to his apartment. The worn traveling clock on the night table said 9:15. The light spilling in under the drawn shade said it as a.m. He groaned and tried to bury his head deeper under the pillow. The pounding on the door refused to go away, grew louder, more insistent. He slid his feet out of bed, yawned, and found a bathrobe and a pair of slippers. Keep your pants on, I'm coming, he called. The pounding stopped. Lydell shuffled across the room, left the chain on, opened the door. A man stood in the doorway, legs spread apart, a scowl on his face. You took long enough, he grumbled. He fished a leather case from his pocket and flipped it open. I'm Roddy, homicide. He held the badge up where Lydell could see it. I'm Lydell, sleepy. What's on your mind? The inspector wants to see you. The man in the hallway didn't fit the usual pattern of a homicide detective. He looked more like a fugitive from a varsity football squad, hatless, his hair in a bristly crew cut. "Is it a come-as-you-are party, or can I get dressed?" "You can get dressed if you don't make a career out of it," Roddy snapped. "I'll wait. Inside." "Be my guest." Lydell unhooked the chain and pushed the door open. The homicide man walked in and looked around incuriously. "The inspector doesn't like to be kept waiting," he told Lydell. He found a chair, pulled a pipe from his pocket, and started packing it from an alligator pouch. Lydell headed for the bathroom and a shower. 10 minutes later, when he walked out, shrugging into a fresh shirt, the homicide man was still sitting in the same chair, rattling the juice in his pipe. "I don't want to appear too curious," Lydell broke the silence, "but do you mind telling me what the hell this is all about?" The homicide man regarded him with no great enthusiasm. "The inspector says he wants to see you. If he wants me to tell you the facts of life, he would have said so." "Thanks for nothing." Lydell slid a tie under his collar and took his time about knotting it. After he shrugged into his jacket, he walked over to the telephone, lifted the receiver, and started dialing a number. "Who are you calling?" Roddy wanted to know. Lydell finished dialing and looked up. "My office. I want to let them know if they need me, I'll be at headquarters." Roddy knotted the dotty from his pipe into an ashtray on the corner of the table. "You're not going to headquarters." Lydell growled deep in his chest and dropped the receiver back into place. "Where are we going?" "Know a babe named Hart? Lucille Hart?" Lydell nodded. "We're going to pay her a visit." The redhead sprawled across the bed, her bare arm crooked languidly over her head. Her thick, coppery hair was a tangle on the black silk of the pillowcase. The black sheet had been pulled down, bearing her to the waist. Her full, perfectly molded breasts were firm, shapely. Her eyes were half closed, her lips parted in a half smile as though she were on the verge of saying something. The ugly, gaping wound in her throat made it improbable that she would ever reveal what it had been she was about to say. Johnny Lydell stared down at her, swore under his breath, and swung around to face the two men who stood behind him, watching him curiously. "When did it happen, Inspector?" Inspector Hurley, a tall man in a rumpled blue suit and a gray fedora on his thick shock of white hair, shrugged. The doc'll have to do an autopsy to say for sure, but he's guessing it wasn't more than 4 hours ago." He dug a fresh piece of gum from his pocket, denuded it of its wrapper, and jammed it between his teeth. "Any ideas, Lydell?" Lydell shook his head and watched without a change of expression while the white-coated men from the medical examiner's office lifted the black sheet, blotted out the girl's face. "No ideas." Roddy stirred impatiently and scowled at the private detective. "What'd you expect him to say, Inspector?" "I expect him to tell me what he knows, if he wants to keep his ticket to work in this town," the inspector snapped. His eyes rolled back to Lydell. "You knew this girl, Lydell?" Lydell fished in his pocket, brought up a cigarette, and hung it in the corner of his mouth. "You're very flattering, Inspector, but what makes you think I know every redhead in the city?" "But you do know this one," Hurley insisted. Lydell lit his cigarette and let the smoke drift from his nostrils. "If you say so," he agreed. "I don't have to say so. We know it." He nodded to Roddy. His eyes didn't leave Lydell. "Tell him." Roddy dug a memo book from his pocket. "You drive a Cadillac convertible 1948, registration 2TR9818. It was a statement, not a question. "You can't prove it by me. I never was very good at numbers." "It's been parked in front of this building all night," Hurley growled. "What do you know about this woman, Lydell?" Lydell removed the cigarette from between his lips and studied the glowing end. "Nothing much. I never met her before yesterday." Roddy snorted indignantly. "You never met her before yesterday, but you let her use your car?" The private detective's eye rolled from his contemplation of his cigarette to the man with the crew cut. "Yeah. Any law against it?" "No law against it, Lydell, only we don't believe it," Hurley cut in. "And for your sake, we ought to believe it." "She was a client of mine. I went out on a job with her. When I got there, it looked like the car was going to be getting under my feet, so I asked her to drive it back here where I could pick it up today." The man from the medical examiner's office walked over to the inspector. "My boys are here, Inspector. All right if we take her?" His eyes flicked at the bulge under the sheet. Hurley nodded, accepted a slip of paper from the man, and scrawled his initials on it. "You say she was a client? What was the case you were working on?" Roddy wanted to know. "That's none of your business. My client's affairs are between her and me," Lydell told him coldly. "Look, Seamus, don't use that tone with me." Roddy spat at him. "This is a murder investigation, and so go ahead and investigate your murder. Leave my client's affairs out of it." "You're in no position to get tough, Lydell."
Roddy growled at him. "You knew this, babe. Your car was parked outside and she turned up dead. If I were in your shoes, I'd try to cooperate." 2 men walked in with a stretcher. Lydell turned his back on the homicide man and smoked glumly as he watched the white-coated attendants transfer what was left of the redhead to the stretcher. When they had finished and had wheeled the body out of the room, he turned back to Roddy. "Stop threatening me, Lieutenant. You couldn't pin anything on me, not unless they started making .45s with a cutting edge and you could prove I walked in my sleep." "I could try." Lydell grinned at him humorlessly. "I bet you could at that." All right, break it up," Hurley grunted. "So you 2 guys don't like each other, but that's not getting us any place on this killing." "You heard the man, Inspector. He thinks I did it. He's got it all wrapped up." "Nobody thinks you killed her, Lydell," Hurley growled. "But you might know who did. That's what we got you down here to find out." Lydell dropped his cigarette to the floor and ground it out. "I don't have any ideas, Inspector. I told you all I know. She called me yesterday, set up a date for me to come here. She had a job for me, and I got started on it right away." He shrugged. "That's about it." Hurley grunted and pounded the wad of gum methodically. "This job you did for her, have you any possible connection with this?" Lydell shook his head. "I don't think so. She had written a few letters she wanted back. She didn't think they'd read too good in front of a judge or jury." "Why should that bother her? She was already divorced. Why the big heat to get the letters back right now?" Roddy wanted to know. "Why don't you ask her? Maybe she wanted to edit them for publication," Lydell snapped at him. "Who had these letters?" Roddy persisted. "I don't remember." "But you do remember that your license comes up for renewal every so often?" Hurley put in. "Meaning?" Lydell looked from Roddy to the inspector. "Meaning that we expect you to cooperate with us and not hamper us in a murder investigation, Lydell," Hurley told him flatly. "You're holding out on us, and I don't like it." "I told you everything I know, Inspector." Hurley scowled at him and pushed his fedora on the back of his head. "I hope for your sake you haven't got any ideas of trying to even the score on your own." "I always like to do everything I can for a client, Inspector." "I know, but take a tip from a guy who knows, and keep your nose out of the police business. She hired you to get some letters back, which made that your business. Then she went out and got herself killed. That made her our business, and we don't need any help." Lydell considered it and shrugged. "I always figure that I keep on working for a client until they tell me I'm through." Hurley pinched at his nostrils impatiently. "Why don't you get smart? Someday you're going to trip over your own feet, and the DA is going to stamp you flat for obstructing justice." Lydell grinned glumly. "Obstructing justice? Me? That's the farthest thing from my mind." "I'm not kidding, Lydell. This is an election year. A kill like this is going to get plenty of newspaper space, and the heat'll be on. If you're holding out and the DA ever finds out, we'll be missing you around here." Lydell nodded. "I know. Don't worry about it, Inspector. If I happen to remember anything that might have a bearing on the killing, I'll let you know." He looked over at Roddy and back. "And if I happen to stumble across the guy who did it, I'll turn him over to you." "Do that," Hurley snapped. "But when you do us both a favor and turn him over to us while he's still breathing." End of Chapter 8. Chapter 8 of Grave Danger by Frank Kane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 8. At first it sounded like a peal of thunder. Then it leveled off to the steady beat of a machine gun. Johnny Lydell opened one bleary eye and decided it was only someone trying to knock down the door to his apartment. The worn traveling clock on the night table said 9:15. The light spilling in under the drawn shade said it as a.m. He groaned and tried to bury his head deeper under the pillow. The pounding on the door refused to go away, grew louder, more insistent. He slid his feet out of bed, yawned, and found a bathrobe and a pair of slippers. "Keep your pants on, I'm coming," he called. The pounding stopped. Lydell shuffled across the room, left the chain on, opened the door. A man stood in the doorway, legs spread apart, a scowl on his face. "You took long enough," he grumbled. He fished a leather case from his pocket and flipped it open. "I'm Roddy, homicide." He held the badge up where Lydell could see it. "I'm Lydell, sleepy. What's on your mind?" "The inspector wants to see you." The man in the hallway didn't fit the usual pattern of a homicide detective. He looked more like a fugitive from a varsity football squad, hatless, his hair in a bristly crew cut. "Is it a come-as-you-are party, or can I get dressed?" You can get dressed if you don't make a career out of it, Roddy snapped. I'll wait. Inside. Be my guest. Lydell unhooked the chain and pushed the door open. The homicide man walked in and looked around incuriously. The inspector doesn't like to be kept waiting, he told Lydell. He found a chair, pulled a pipe from his pocket, and started packing it from an alligator pouch. Lydell headed for the bathroom and a shower. 10 minutes later, when he walked out, shrugging into a fresh shirt, the homicide man was still sitting in the same chair, rattling the juice in his pipe. I don't want to appear too curious, Lydell broke the silence, but do you mind telling me what the hell this is all about? The homicide man regarded him with no great enthusiasm. The inspector says he wants to see you. If he wants me to tell you the facts of life, he would have said so. Thanks for nothing. Lydell slid a tie under his collar and took his time about knotting it. After he shrugged into his jacket, he walked over to the telephone, lifted the receiver, and started dialing a number. Who are you calling? Roddy wanted to know. Lydell finished dialing and looked up. My office. I want to let them know if they need me, I'll be at headquarters. Roddy knotted the dotty from his pipe into an ashtray on the corner of the table. You're not going to headquarters. Lydell growled deep in his chest and dropped the receiver back into place. Where are we going? Know a babe named Hart? Lucille Hart? Lydell nodded. We're going to pay her a visit. The redhead sprawled across the bed, her bare arm crooked languidly over her head. Her thick, coppery hair was a tangle on the black silk of the pillowcase. The black sheet had been pulled down, bearing her to the waist. Her full, perfectly molded breasts were firm, shapely. Her eyes were half closed, her lips parted in a half smile as though she were on the verge of saying something. The ugly, gaping wound in her throat made it improbable that she would ever reveal what it had been she was about to say. Johnny Lydell stared down at her, swore under his breath, and swung around to face the two men who stood behind him, watching him curiously. When did it happen, Inspector? Inspector Hurley, a tall man in a rumpled blue suit and a gray fedora on his thick shock of white hair, shrugged. The doc will have to do an autopsy to say for sure, but he's guessing it wasn't more than 4 hours ago. He dug a fresh piece of gum from his pocket, denuded it of its wrapper, and jammed it between his teeth. Any ideas, Lydell? Lydell shook his head and watched without a change of expression while the white-coated men from the medical examiner's office lifted the black sheet, blotted out the girl's face. No ideas. Roddy stirred impatiently and scowled at the private detective. What'd you expect him to say, Inspector? I expect him to tell me what he knows, if he wants to keep his ticket to work in this town, the inspector snapped. His eyes rolled back to Lydell. You knew this girl, Lydell? Lydell fished in his pocket, brought up a cigarette, and hung it in the corner of his mouth. You're very flattering, Inspector, but what makes you think I know every redhead in the city? But you do know this one, Hurley insisted. Lydell lit his cigarette and let the smoke drift from his nostrils. If you say so, he agreed. I don't have to say so. We know it. He nodded to Roddy. His eyes didn't leave Lydell. Tell him. Roddy dug a memo book from his pocket. You drive a Cadillac convertible 1948, registration 2TR9818. It was a statement, not a question. You can't prove it by me. I never was very good at numbers. It's been parked in front of this building all night, Hurley growled. What do you know about this woman, Lydell? Lydell removed the cigarette from between his lips and studied the glowing end. Nothing much. I never met her before yesterday. Roddy snorted indignantly. You never met her before yesterday, but you let her use your car? The private detective's eye rolled from his contemplation of his cigarette to the man with the crew cut. Yeah. Any law against it? No law against it, Lydell, only we don't believe it. Hurley cut in. And for your sake, we ought to believe it. She was a client of mine. I went out on a job with her. When I got there, it looked like the car was going to be getting under my feet, so I asked her to drive it back here where I could pick it up today. The man from the medical examiner's office walked over to the inspector. My boys are here, Inspector. All right if we take her? His eyes flicked at the bulge under the sheet. Hurley nodded, accepted a slip of paper from the man, and scrawled his initials on it. You say she was a client? What was the case you were working on? Roddy wanted to know. That's none of your business. My client's affairs are between her and me, Lydell told him coldly. Look, Seamus, don't use that tone with me. Roddy spat at him. This is a murder investigation, and... So go ahead and investigate your murder. Leave my client's affairs out of it. You're in no position to get tough, Lydell, Roddy growled at him. You knew this, babe. Your car was parked outside, and she turned up dead. If I were in your shoes, I'd try to cooperate. Two men walked in with a stretcher. Lydell turned his back on the homicide man and smoked glumly as he watched the white-coated attendants transfer what was left of the redhead to the stretcher. When they had finished and had wheeled the body out of the room, he turned back to Roddy. "Stop threatening me, Lieutenant. You couldn't pin anything on me, not unless they started making .45s with a cutting edge and you could prove I walked in my sleep." "I could try." Lydell grinned at him humorlessly. "I bet you could at that." All right, break it up," Hurley grunted. "So you two guys don't like each other, but that's not getting us any place on this killing." "You heard the man, Inspector. He thinks I did it. He's got it all wrapped up." "Nobody thinks you killed her, Lydell," Hurley growled. "But you might know who did. That's what we got you down here to find out." Lydell dropped his cigarette to the floor and ground it out. "I don't have any ideas, Inspector. I told you all I know. She called me yesterday, set up a date for me to come here. She had a job for me, and I got started on it right away." He shrugged. "That's about it." Hurley grunted and pounded the wad of gum methodically. "This job you did for her, have you any possible connection with this?" Lydell shook his head. "I don't think so. She had written a few letters she wanted back. She didn't think they'd read too good in front of a judge or jury." "Why should that bother her? She was already divorced. Why the big heat to get the letters back right now?" Roddy wanted to know. "Why don't you ask her? Maybe she wanted to edit them for publication," Lydell snapped at him. "Who had these letters?" Roddy persisted. "I don't remember." "But you do remember that your license comes up for renewal every so often?" Hurley put in. "Meaning?" Lydell looked from Roddy to the inspector. "Meaning that we expect you to cooperate with us and not hamper us in a murder investigation, Lydell," Hurley told him flatly. "You're holding out on us, and I don't like it." "I told you everything I know, Inspector." Hurley scowled at him and pushed his fedora on the back of his head. "I hope for your sake you haven't got any ideas of trying to even the score on your own." "I always like to do everything I can for a client, Inspector." "I know, but take a tip from a guy who knows and keep your nose out of the police business. She hired you to get some letters back, which made that your business. Then she went out and got herself killed. That made her our business, and we don't need any help." Lydell considered it and shrugged. "I always figure that I keep on working for a client until they tell me I'm through." Hurley pinched at his nostrils impatiently. "Why don't you get smart? Someday you're going to trip over your own feet, and the DA is going to stamp you flat for obstructing justice." Lydell grinned glumly. "Obstructing justice? Me? That's the farthest thing from my mind." "I'm not kidding, Lydell. This is an election year. A kill like this is going to get plenty of newspaper space, and the heat'll be on. If you're holding out and the DA ever finds out, we'll be missing you around here." Lydell nodded. "I know. Don't worry about it, Inspector. If I happen to remember anything that might have a bearing on the killing, I'll let you know." He looked over at Roddy and back. "And if I happen to stumble across the guy who did it, I'll turn him over to you." "Do that," Hurley snapped. "But when you do us both a favor and turn him over to us while he's still breathing." End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of Grave Danger by Frank Kane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 9. The street air smelled fresh and clean after the apartment with its odor of death permeated every corner. Johnny Lydell stood on the sidewalk outside Lucille Hart's apartment house and filled his lungs with it. He gave no sign that he was aware of the man in the gray suit who lounged against the fender of a car halfway down the block, ostensibly reading a newspaper. Lydell decided to leave his car where it was parked, turned west, and headed for the IRT subway. The man in the gray suit folded his newspaper, stuck it in his jacket pocket, and started to follow. When Lydell walked down the subway steps to the platform, the man in the gray suit wasn't far behind. When they boarded the train, he leaned against the door on the platform, opened his paper, seemed to lose himself in a sports column. Lydell hung on a strap, watching the underground lights flash past the train window, and tried to organize his thoughts. At 42nd Street, Lydell followed the crowd to Barking and shouldered his way to the station. The man in the gray suit followed. When he was aware of Lydell's eyes on him, he started looking around as though unsure of his destination. As soon as the tail's back was turned, Lydell crossed the platform and melted into the crowd waiting for an uptown express. The tail turned around and gave every evidence of having lost his quarry. Finally, he headed for the flight of stairs at the end of the platform and went up two at a time. Lydell waited until the detective had disappeared up the stairs and joined the crowd going to the crosstown shuttle. At Grand Central, he headed for the East Side subway at Lexington Avenue, pushing through the turnstile and waited for the downtown local. On the platform, he looked around. The man in the gray suit was nowhere in sight. Lydell studied the faces of the other passengers on the platform, wondered idly which of them was the real tail. The first tail had been so obvious and was so easy to shake he knew a real tail had been working further back, waiting for him to shake the man in the gray suit. When the local barreled into the station, he got into the last car and started working his way forward. A stream of passengers followed in his wake as he opened a path between the strap hangers. By the fourth car forward, he had lost all but 2 of his followers and found himself a seat. The heavy-set man dropped into a seat opposite him, deposited a package between his feet, and started reading the car cards. The other, a dark-skinned man, took up a position at the end of the car, seemingly immersed in a Spanish-language newspaper. Lydell settled for the man with the newspaper. At each stop, the dark-skinned man would start, look around, and peer at the station markers as though uncertain of his destination. Lydell gave no sign he had made him and waited until the train pulled into the 14th Street station. The tail looked up and satisfied himself that Lydell was staying on. Just as the door started to close, Lydell got to his feet and squeezed through the closing door onto the station. An express was loading across the platform. He got into it just before the door closed. The last view he had of the Spanish detective was of his face flattened against the glass door of the local, scowling his frustration as the express pulled out of the station and rocketed past the slow-moving local. At Brooklyn Bridge, Johnny Lydell debarked, caught a cruising cab, and gave a number on Houston Street. The driver was a short, fat little man with a greasy chauffeur's cap shoved on the back of his head. The frayed end of a toothpick protruded from between his lips. He looked Lydell over with knowing eyes.
"You sure that's for you, mister? That ain't exactly the carriage trade, that neighborhood."
Lydell nodded and settled back among the cushions. "That's where I want to go. All right with you?" The driver considered it and shrugged his shoulder.
"Okay. I just thought you might be a stranger around here. It just so happens I know some girls uptown."
"I'm not looking for a girl," Lydell told him. Some of the interest drained out of the driver's face. He flipped his toothpick through the open window and slid around in his seat. Lydell winced as the cab shot away from the curb and threaded through the traffic. The driver spotted a hole between 2 trucks, threw the cab at it, decided at the last minute he couldn't make it, and jammed on the brakes with enough force to skid Lydell halfway off the seat. A few minutes later, the cab rolled to a stop in front of an old dilapidated 2-story building on Houston Street. The driver swung around on his seat.
"This the place?"
He eyed the smoke-grimmed facade with distaste. Lydell nodded, pushed a bill through the window at him, got out and stood on the sidewalk. He waited until the cab roared into an illegal U-turn and disappeared in the direction from which it had come. Then he crossed the sidewalk and walked up the 3 unwashed steps that led to the vestibule. He went through into a darkened and smelly hallway, guided himself along the wall to the end of a musty corridor, and knocked on a door. After a moment there was a dim scraping sound, a faint stirring of air. A gravelly voice close at hand inquired.
"Yeah?"
"Johnny Lydell, Duke. I've got to see the dummy." The panel scraped shut, and after a moment the door swung open. The room beyond was in darkness. As soon as the door had closed behind Lydell, the doorman snapped on a dim light.
"He's putting a crew of fresh fish through their paces, Lydell."
The doorman was a thin, shriveled man in a collarless shirt. When he talked, his toothless gums glowed pinkly in the half-light.
"We got a couple of new territories opened up."
"Is it going to be long?" The little man shrugged. A muscle kept jumping under his left eye.
"Not too long. You know your way. Why don't you go up and wait in his office?"
Lydell nodded and walked to a flight of stairs in the rear of the room. At the top of the stairs, a door led into a huge room. The windows were boarded over, and heavy burlap covered the boarding to keep out any light. There was no sign of the partitions that had once separated the rooms. Along the walls, a group of ragged, unshaven men were dumped on wooden benches in varying attitudes of fatigue. They didn't bother to raise their eyes as Lydell walked in. He crossed the length of the room to a small office at the far end. Inside, it was furnished only with a large desk, an oversized swivel chair, and 2 straight-backed kitchen chairs. It was empty. Lydell walked to the back wall of the office and fumbled around with the molding until he found the cleverly hidden switch. He pressed it and stood aside while a camouflage panel slid open. A flight of iron stairs led to the building next door. The entire house had been converted into what resembled a huge auditorium. The floor between the first and second story had been ripped out, making it a huge 2-storied room. A fat man who seemed to be spilling off the sides of a stool stared up at him from the floor below. Then the fat face was creased by a smile. He motioned for Lydell to join him. Lydell descended the stairs and threaded his way through a group of ragged men, similar to the group in the other building. These men, however, wore signs around their necks proclaiming them blind or deaf and dumb.
Well, well, my very good friend, Mr. Lydell.
The dummy stuck out a damp, pudgy hand that had dimples for knuckles. There was a smile pasted on his overripe lips, but his eyes were shadowed with concern.
It's always good to see you.
He motioned to a chair next to him.
You don't mind if I finish with my boys?
Go ahead, Lydell nodded. Training beggars for a living has always fascinated me. The dummy clapped his hands and a door at the far end of the arena opened. A man shuffled in, wearing a sign proclaiming him to be deaf and dumb. He shuffled slowly across the room toward where the dummy sat. Halfway across, a man stepped up behind him with a klaxon in his hand. Suddenly, the quiet of the room was blasted by the sound of the horn. The man with the sign around his neck continued forward, giving no sign that he had heard. The dummy nodded and pursed his lips.
He'll do. Give him the show break between 48th and the Circle,
he instructed the man with the klaxon. The man with the sign started to protest.
That's a dry run, dummy. All the show break gravy's south of 47th. Give me a break. And
the dummy cut him off with a wave of his hand.
You don't want it. There's a lot of these guys do.
The deaf and dumb man shuffled off, muttering under his breath. It must take you a long time to train the boys like that, Lydell grunted. He didn't move a hair when that horn blasted behind him. The dummy shrugged.
Sometimes it's not as hard as it looks, my friend.
He looked around the room.
Most of them are so soaked with smoke their reactions are delayed anyhow. A little training, and I show them how they can make it pay.
Are they dependable?
For a time. Then they crack up and go back to the Bowery where I found them. Or Bellevue.
The dummy leaned back and laced his pudgy fingers across his stomach.
But you didn't come here to learn the secrets of my trade.
No, but I think your boys can help me. Lydell dug a cigarette from his pocket, offered one to the fat man, and drew a shake of the head. There are a couple of people I'm very anxious to meet. The fat man's eyes were expressionless, almost lost behind their heavy, discolored pouches.
It's possible.
He disturbed the multiple chins with a nod.
Who are these men?
A petty larceny shakedown artist named Reuter, Carl Reuter, and a slugger named Stanley Kalo. The fat man pursed his wet lips. His eyes were hidden by heavily veined lids.
You're asking for trouble, Lydell. They're bad boys. Very bad boys.
He opened his eyes and studied Lydell.
They're part of the organization.
Lydell nodded. I know who they are. What I want you to tell me is where they are.
It could be very dangerous for me if the organization were to find out I was working with you, my friend.
The fat man's voice was blubbery, almost as though it were choked by the rolls of fat on his neck.
You're not in good standing.
Lydell grinned humorlessly. Word sure gets around. The fat man made a deprecatory gesture, palms raised upward.
I have hundreds of eyes and ears open for me every hour of the day and night. People are rarely careful of what they say or do in front of dumb beggars, particularly if they're blind or deaf and dumb.
What's the word on me? The dummy drummed on his knees with fat fingers and pursed his lips.
You moved in on a man who was protected by the organization.
He closed his eyes, seemed withdrawn.
You roughed him up and incapacitated his bodyguard. You're on notice not to get in the organization's way.
The eyes opened again. And if I do? The fat man licked at his pouty lips with the tip of his tongue.
You're to be turned over to the enforcers.
Lydell nodded. That's the way I heard it, too. He took a last drag on his cigarette, dropped it to the floor, and crushed it out. But to get back to the subject, how soon do you think your boys can turn up either Kalo or Reuter or both? The fat man's eyes showed surprise.
You still want them?
More than ever.
I don't know, my friend. It's a big risk for...
He broke off as his eyes followed Lydell's hand into his pocket and out with a roll of bills. He made an effort to pull his eyes away from the money, but failed. It's worth 100 now and 100 when you get them. Lydell peeled off 2 50s and folded them between his fingers. The fat man tapped his finger on his knee and exerted superhuman effort to keep his hands off the money.
I've already told you that it could mean a lot of trouble for you.
Let me worry about that. Lydell held out the money. The fat man licked at his lips, finally gave up the struggle, and took the bills.
All right, my friend.
He tucked the money into his pocket with loving care.
"It will be at your office all day."
Lydell shook his head. "I'll be keeping pretty much on the move. I'll keep in touch with my answering service. You can leave a message there for me or slip it under the office door."
"We'll find you."
The fat man pasted the wet smile back on his face.
"Good luck."
Lydell nodded and stood up. "I can use it. But you still think I'm going up against a stacked deck?"
"Indubitably."
The dummy nodded.
"There's only one chance in 1,000 you'll make it. But as long as there's that one chance, I'll string along with you. It may pay me to."
Lydell stared at him, then grinned. "Don't tell me they got you on the hook, too. You gotta pay protection?"
"Everybody pays protection. Or if they don't run. Even the dummy." He shrugged. "Maybe if you do manage to crack the organization, it will save me money."
"For your sake, then, I hope I manage to stay alive."
"I'm willing to gamble on it." He sighed. "That's always been my failing, my friend. At heart, I'm a gambler."
"Why not? It's my blood you're gambling with." End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Of Grave Danger by Frank Kane. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 10. From the school for beggars, Johnny Lydell taxied to the office of the Dispatch. He pushed through the glass door into the city room, which was in a state resembling suspended animation between editions. Desks were scattered around the room in organized confusion. Scraps of paper, crumpled newspapers, typewriters of varying vintages, telephones that had lost their luster were spread throughout. A few men in shirt sleeves, their coats hung over the backs of their chairs, were pecking away at typewriters, calling out periodically for the copy boys who were scooting between the desks, picking up copy and distributing proofs. At other desks, men were sitting back, drinking coffee out of cardboard containers or just staring ahead, organizing their thoughts for the follows they were to write on stories they'd already done for the early editions. 4 copymen were working on the rim, and 2 in this slot slashing copy down to size. Johnny Lydell worked his way through the desks, headed for a frosted glass door stenciled Managing Editor. He knocked, but when there was no response, he decided the knock couldn't be heard above the general confusion. So he turned the knob and pushed the door open. A thin, gray-haired man with sharp, inquisitive features sat behind the only desk in the room. He looked up as Lydell walked in, his eyes widened, his lean face split in a grin.
"Well, well, who says there's nothing to mental telepathy? I was just thinking about you, Johnny."
Jim Keeley shoved out a gnarled claw.
"How you been?"
"Pretty good, Jim. Got a minute?" Keeley nodded, wadded up the copy of the opposition AM sheet he was clipping for follows, and tossed it into the barrel-sized wastebasket at his elbow.
"Sure."
He jabbed at the button on the base of his phone.
"But while you're here, you can give us some inside dope on that redhead that got her throat cut this morning."
The door opened. A copy boy stuck his head in.
"Bring me the proofs on that heart-killing story Hutch is working on, son," Keeley told him.
When the boy's head was withdrawn, Keeley turned back to Lydell.
"I hear you were right on deck. Know the girl?"
"She was a client. I was getting some letters back for her." The copy boy was back with a galley proof and handed it to Lydell at Keeley's direction. The private detective read through it, nodded. "That about covers it."
"Covers it, hell," Keeley snorted. "There's more to it than just that handout, and you know it. Come on, Johnny, give. We can't go to press with that tripe. That won't sell papers."
Lydell tossed the proof onto the desk. "Sorry, Jim, but that's all I know about it. Just what Hurley he gave out. She got it about 5 this morning, had her throat cut, and the police are running down clues, just like it says there." Keeley glared at him and nodded for the copy boy to get out.
"That's a big help, Johnny," he grumbled. "I thought you had a story for us."
"Maybe I do have, Jim. One that'd make this Lucille Hart killing look sick by comparison. But I'll need help." The newspaper man nodded and dug a battered briar and some tobacco out of his desk.
"I'm listening."
"I've stumbled into something big. Maybe too big for me to tackle all by myself." He watched while Keeley packed the bowl of his pipe. "Ever hear of a guy named Kalo? Stanley Kalo?" Keeley stopped tamping the tobacco into the bowl and looked up.
"Yeah, he's one of the boys in the waterfront mob. Runs Pier A for the organization."
Lydell nodded. "That's the guy."
"What about him?"
Keeley wanted to know. "What kind of a tie-in would a hood like that have with a white tie operator like Tony Verone, Jim?" Keeley jammed the pipe stem between his teeth, lit a match, and considered while he sucked the pipe into life.
"Plenty,"
he said finally.
They're both in the organization, Johnny. Barone handles the white stuff, women and powder. Kalo handles the rough stuff on the docks. They both work for the same guy.
Marty Regan, eh? How about this organization? What do you newspaper guys like to call the crime empire? Keeley blew a stream of blue-gray smoke at the ceiling.
Don't sell it short, Johnny. Regan really has these boys whipped into an organization, and he's making it work. Do you know how it's set up?
Lydell shook his head. Just roughly. The newspaper man leaned back and hooked his heel on the corner of his desk.
You know, there were 6 mobs operating a couple of years back. Barone had his mob, Hernandez had the Spicks, Cleach was running Harlem. All of them were at each other's necks. Every so often one would move in on the other, and then there'd be a killing.
Now they've got it fixed so no one cuts in on the other, eh?
It's more than that, Johnny. They've gotten together and pooled everything. Contacts, money, troops. Everything. It used to be that one mob would get into a battle with another, and both would lose valuable manpower, and it brought plenty of publicity and heat from the cops. Now that can't happen.
Lydell scowled and shook his head. I can't buy it. I can't see a guy like Verone throwing his racket into the pot. And
he didn't. Each guy kept what he had. The organization is just sort of an overall structure.
The juice rattled noisily in Keeley's pipe.
Here's the way it works. Each boss keeps his own racket, his own territory. He's top dog in that area, and nobody can be killed or roughed up in his area without his okay.
So I've heard, Lydell told him dryly.
Now he can do the job himself, or bring in outside talent to do it. But nothing can be done in his territory unless he says it can be done.
Suppose Regan and the other boys think it's necessary. Keeley chewed on the stem of his pipe.
Then they have a regular board of directors meeting with all the local bosses, getting one vote. If he's outvoted, he has to give the okay.
Lydell shook his head. Sounds pretty foolproof.
Mobs went for it like a baby after candy. Look what it does. Now a mob boss not only has his own guns behind him, but the guns of every other mob in town. Nobody can move in on him and muscle him out, and he can't be knocked off by somebody trying to move in. It's a natural.
And this was Regan's idea? What's he get out of it? Keeley shrugged.
He's the chairman of the board of the richest cartel in the world. It's a lifetime job with no headaches.
Nobody's ever tried for him?
They couldn't get within a mile of him. He carries one of the best shotgun crews in the country around with him every place he goes.
A shotgun crew? Keeley grinned.
Tommy guns are old-fashioned. A shotgun makes a better impression. Instead of a lot of little holes, it really tears the hell out of you. Psychologically, it's a better weapon.
Lydell fumbled for a cigarette and lit it. So Kalo and Verone are both on the board of directors, huh? Anybody who goes up against Kalo has to take on the whole mob. That it? Keeley nodded.
Pretty much. But who'd be that crazy?
Me. The editor's jaw dropped and he took the pipe from between his teeth.
You nuts? You're just one man. That's the best damn set-up co-op in the country. You couldn't make a dent in it.
Tell me more about this Kalo, Jim. What's his graft?
Strong-arming, mostly. He runs Pier A personally, and has his own boys on most of the other racket-controlled piers. He short gangs. He shakes down importers and shippers. He brings what he likes into the country. He's the boss of the waterfront. That answer your question?
Lydell nodded. Mostly. How come nobody's ever gone after him? He makes no bones about what he's doing from all I can gather. He robs them, slugs them, shakes them down, and makes them like it. How come they stand still for it?
What would you suggest?
Go after him. Catch him with the goods. Smash him. Keeley grinned at him and shook his head.
It's not that simple. In the first place, there's the question of getting him with the goods. It's almost impossible.
What about the cops?
What about them? The crooked ones won't lift a finger to stop him, and the decent ones get their knuckles rapped when they do. I just told you that the mobs have consolidated their contracts. They're big, Johnny. Real big. This is no petty larceny operation. Do you know that the mob's takes from just the docks hit over $120 million last year? For that kind of loot, you can buy yourself real protection. Not just beat cops, but deputy commissioners and congressmen and senators.
Lydell whistled soundlessly.
You want an idea of how much absolute control these mobs have over the pier? A couple of years ago on Pier 46 in North River, 10 tons of steel disappeared. They called it pilferage. Get it? 10 tons of steel disappear, but nobody saw it go. You think they just stuck it under their sweaters and walked off with it?
He jabbed the stem of his pipe at Lydell.
You know the kind of a fix they'd have to get away with 10 tons of steel? You realize how many people it had to go through?
Lydell nodded. I'm beginning to. I'm also beginning to see why a guy like Kalo would be an important guide of Verone and his customers for the white stuff. He could clear it right through his pier. Keeley nodded.
Probably does.
Lydell tapped a thin collar of ash from his cigarette. You seem to know a lot about Kalo and his operation, Jim.
I should. I had a man working on him for weeks, gathering material for a series of articles. Would have blasted him right before an investigating committee.
Why didn't they run? Keeley shrugged.
The publisher killed him at the last minute.
Lydell scowled. Why? Would have sold papers.
And it would have lost advertising. I told you these boys aren't plain hoods. They've got their fingers in 100 pies. All the circulation in the world won't do us any good if they cut off our advertising.
He made a face as though he had a bad taste in his mouth, and tried unsuccessfully to wipe it out with a pull on the pipe. And Marty Regan could make it stick. Lydell walked over and leaned on the edge of the desk. I thought a newspaper dealt primarily with the news. What are you, a newspaper or a shopping guide?
Look, friend, don't snarl at me. I don't like it any better than you do. All I know is we have payrolls to meet, and the unions say we gotta meet them. And we can't make them by cutting off our advertisers' noses. That's what the front office says.
Lydell straightened up and shook his head. It's not like the old days.
You can say that again. Today the only difference between working on a newspaper and in a whorehouse is that we don't have a piano in our front parlor.
You say you had that series already written and documented? Keeley nodded. How about letting me use the stuff your boy dug? You're not going to use it, Lydell argued.
I would if I could, but it's locked away nice and safe in the publisher's safe.
Keeley knocked the dottle out of the pipe on the heel of his hand.
I might be able to fix it for you to meet the guy who dug the stuff for us. He might have some ideas.
Good. Who is he?
Tom Farrell.
Keeley stared at Lydell for a moment.
You know, if you fumble this one, you can put a couple of guys on the spot. You sure you want to go ahead with it?
More than ever.
You're always a stubborn bastard. But after all, it's your skin. If you like to wear it with holes in it.
The newspaper man reached over, snagged a phone, and dialed a number. After a moment, he muttered into the mouthpiece. He nodded several times and tossed the instrument back on its hook.
Farrell's just finishing up a piece for the next edition. He'll be free in a few minutes. I told him you wanted some dope on the waterfront.
I hope he kept his notes.
He'll do better than that. He's going to take you down there to talk to a guy who knows the docks inside out. You can get your dope from the horse's mouth.
Thanks, Jim.
The man behind the desk glowered at him. Don't thank me. I just hope you know what you're doing.
I hope you get your hope. End of chapter 10.